Weather,
for in person.
maybe.
Everyone should be used to the cold weather by now, right? We've had it for a week. Um, Hello and welcome to today's program, What to Expect, the Trump Administration and Economic Security Policy in Asia. Thank you all for joining us here at the Korea Society's office on 350 Madison Avenue. My name is Tom Byrne, and I'm President and CEO of the Korea Society. Today's discussion will cover trade, tariffs, and the impact on critical technologies. We'll also address U.S.-China economic cooperation and its competition and its impact on Northeast Asian countries such as Korea and Japan. We are honored to be joined today by our esteemed panelists. Navin Girishankar is President of the Economic Security and Technology Department at CSIS. He previously served as counselor to the U.S. Deputy Secretary of Commerce on a wide range of domestic and international issues. In that role, he crafted a place-based framework for industrial investments in strategic technologies, commerce's approach to U.S. trade economic relations, and U.S. economic diplomacy efforts with its allies in the Indo-Pacific region, Europe, and the Global South. Han-koo, former trade minister of the Republic of Korea, has been a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics since June 2023. His research focuses on international trade policy, industrial policy, supply chain resilience, and economic security and international trade negotiations. Before we begin the conversation, I would like to thank the Korea Foundation and our corporate sponsors, the names of which are prominently displayed on the lobby screen, for making this program possible. We are welcoming your questions live, and we will provide an opportunity for in-person attendees to ask questions directly, of course. For our virtual audience, please send your questions throughout the program to policy@koreasociety.org. So I'll begin with Navin. Navin, you previously served as counselor to the U.S. Deputy Secretary of Commerce. The scope of President Trump's ambition for economic security policy and the state of global geoeconomics have changed markedly since his first term in office. What is your forecast in terms of the new administration's priorities for economic security policy in Asia? And how do you think these policies will play out? When we were talking before we came to the stage, you called it the delta between Trump 1 and Trump 2. Maybe you could give your introductory remarks on that.
Well, thank you, Tom, and thank you for inviting me. Pleasure to be here with y'all. Just to sort of go back before going forward, I think starting with the first Trump administration, dramatically under the Biden administration, and I expect in Trump 2.0, you have a set of policies and policy goals that I would call economic security goals that are actually quite consistent. That hasn't changed in a significant way. And so those goals are U.S. competitiveness and reindustrialization, the security of our supply chains, including reducing vulnerabilities and dependencies in these supply chains, and national security interests. And that actually, to President Trump's credit, in the first administration, he began to develop what was the basis of this. Mm-hmm. And so you see policies like export controls, you see a focus on people and places left behind in the U.S., and an attempt to reshore in some ways. Of course, one can debate the mix of policies, but that started there. And it got built out significantly under the Biden administration, including through the landmark legislation, the Bipartisan CHIPS Act, Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, of course, the Inflation Reduction Act as well. In conjunction with a significant expansion of export controls, the evolution of investment screening, including outbound investment screening, sanctions, so on and so forth. I would expect this mix of policies to be on the table, including tariffs, in the Trump 2 administration. And so when you look at the EO that was issued on America First trade policy, what was interesting was what was missing, which was no announcement of tariffs as of yet. I suspect those are coming, as the president has said. But what was in that EO was the full menu of economic security tools that I talked about. And that's good in the sense that it shows some consistency through time. The challenge is going to be, how do you work these together with some form of strategic coordination that delivers impact? And what's the goal? And the way I understand the goals is ensuring economic and technology advantage, reindustrializing the US, reducing choke points, and ensuring in critical areas that our national security is preserved. Now, how do I see this going forward? I think, let me take a couple of areas to just underscore what I think is, in effect, a national consensus around some of these things. So I don't think those will change. I think there's bipartisan consensus on the need to strengthen our capability to enforce export controls in sensitive technologies. And the key issue here is that we're in the midst of a accelerating technology competition, primarily with China, across a number of technologies, not one Sputnik moment, but 5 Sputnik moments. AI, chips, quantum, clean tech, biotech, all of these. And so the export control agenda to maintain advantage and to prevent the seepage of dual-use technologies to China, where there is a civil-military fusion, has broad consensus. Just look on the Hill, look in the administration, you'll see the signals. There is also an interest in what investment screening could look like, so that one doesn't invest in the acceleration of those advancements in China, for example. I think that will be consistent. I think the delta is the following. If you think of reindustrialization, the Biden administration's approach was, let's use strategic public investments to leverage private investment and FDI in particular areas like chips, like EVs and EV batteries. And as a result, there were significant, meaningful increases in FDI and meaningful increases in private investment in these areas across different geographies of the US. I'll just take an example. Billion-dollar investments from South Korea in the United States in these emerging technologies, clean tech, semiconductors, so on and so forth, were at an all-time high. All-time high. A new pathway to economic integration. And it's happening right now. And these are in red states, in blue states, in purple states, all over the place, which kind of answers the mail on the Trump, Biden, and Trump 2.0 goal of making sure that people who have been left behind are no longer left behind. So let's see how that goes. I think his statements at the Davos forum, which he zoomed into, President Trump articulated a desire for more investment in the U.S. So that's actually interesting and positive. The delta will be, like, what's the nature of tariffs? As we know they're coming. Are they going to be strategic? Will they be across the board? And how will they sequence them? Will they sequence them with China first and then neighbors and allies like Mexico and Canada? The sequencing matters because it affects then, what kind of deals can you strike and how do partners as well as competitors respond? And then you have this iterated game and you have to play that out. So I think that's going to be important. I would just say this. The enduring test of tariff policy, in my view, should be, will it increase U.S. technology advantage in critical technologies, or will it undermine it? And for that, you have to go technology by technology, value chain by value chain, and understand which relationships we currently have and how tariff policy would affect them. And that's not something one can just answer sort of in the abstract. We can have high-level discussions about the impact on the cost of production and so on and so forth. But really the question is, what does it do for technology innovation? Because that's what's going to drive productivity growth, the security of our markets, our resilience to shocks over the long term. So.
Okay, well, that is a very comprehensive opening remark. So let me turn to Han-koo. During the first Trump administration, you served as commercial attaché at the Korean Embassy in Washington, D.C. At that time, you were involved in negotiating amendments to the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement and also participated in Section 232 tariff negotiations, I guess, on the steel industry. Based on that experience, Um, what do you expect from the Trump 2.0, and what does Korea and other Asian countries, what do they expect, and are they taking any precautionary actions to anticipating some stepped up tariffs or whatever?
Mhm. Yes. Thanks for having me, Tom. And I also, Navin set the scene with very, kind of insightful kind of, view perspective of this overall landscape in the economic security as well as, tariff. I can talk about this Korea first, and then, other Asian countries in terms of how these countries are trying to kind of respond to the Trump. First, in terms of Korea, I think in the first Trump administration, Korea was in a much more vulnerable situation when it comes to this tariff, because even during the campaign, President Trump constantly, criticized this Korea U.S. FTA, Korea's FTA, as a horrible deal. So actually, Korea was actually one of the first target of kind of renegotiating this Korea's FTA, and then we all remember that it really went on the brink of kind of termination of Korea's FTA. But in the end, Korea was the first country to make a deal with this first Trump administration. But now in this Trump 2.0, it seems that the focus is first on China, and then Mexico, Canada, and then also this across the board, this 10 or 20% across the board tariff. That seems to be right now the focus of the Trump 2.0. If we look at this executive order, which was released on day one about this America First, trade policy. So, but it doesn't mean that Korea can be, kind of relaxed or, complacent. Especially, we all know the current political turmoil in Korea. And then right now, what I see is that if this, we don't know yet, but, someday the across the board tariff is very likely to come. But if that happens, I think it's all about sort of a kind of a negotiation, sort of making a deal. So I think it may create some sort of a prisoner's dilemma situation. Because if the U.S. kind of, slap all this massive tariff on all countries, I think the best case scenario for the rest of countries to kind of join forces and then kind of push back and then kind of retaliate, etc. So that it could sort of change the dynamics in the U.S. domestic, circumstance. But instead, what we may more likely to see is that each country is kind of race to the administration to kind of make a deal, by making some concession and then try to find some sort of peace agreement as soon as possible. So it creates some sort of, in a way, kind of competitive kind of race between the rest of countries. So I think, especially in Asia, many of these countries are export-oriented, countries. So, Korea right now, this political scene is very, very chaotic, chaos. So it's a, in a disadvantageous position to make a sort of a kind of robust deal with this, Trump administration, at least at the top level,
Right.
And the rest of Asia, I think that, European Union or China, they have a strong kind of bargaining power. But I don't think also these countries want to escalate this tension because it is different from Trump 1. I mean, we saw that this really sweeping victory of the second Trump administration. And I think many countries may see this as a sort of mandate, which was provided by the American people. So in that sense, I think many countries really kind of try to find some sort of a deal making with the Trump administration. So overall, I think that this caused very kind of uncertain trade environment, and it may have sort of a negative impact on this export-oriented kind of trading nation, in which case many of these Asian countries belong to. But also, I think it provides some sort of opportunity, window of opportunity, because we know that this U.S.-China geopolitical tension and also trade conflict may continue, and then many global companies try to kind of diversify and sort of de-risk from this previous over reliance or over concentration of their supply chain in China. So in the process, we may see some sort of a new opportunities opening in the Asian country, in Southeast Asian countries. We saw that, for example, semiconductor industry, this sort of the packaging and this part of the supply chains are kind of really emerging in the the Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam. So in that sense, I think it gives a sort of mixed picture of opportunities as well as challenges.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, you rightly point out, Navin, that Korea has been a huge investor in the U.S. in recent years. Last year, the pledge investment from South Korea was more than $20 billion, which was the top country. For the first time, South Korea was up there, but it's the wave has really picked up. Hopefully, it hasn't crested. But so Han-koo, do you see a different tone? I mean, in Trump 2.0, what we know so far towards South Korea. Do you find it encouraging that when President Yoon Suk-yeol made his congratulatory phone call, that Trump didn't pan the Chorus Free Trade Agreement? In contrast, he noted that Korea is cooperating with the U.S. on maintenance, repair, and overhaul, the MRO, in the shipbuilding industry, and he looked upon that very favorably. Are you willing to extrapolate from that the relationship between Korea and the U.S. will be much more constructive than it was under Trump 1.0?
I think obviously that is a very encouraging sign,
Mm-hmm.
and I mentioned that in the at least short term, we are worried about this political turmoil and the negative impact that may have on the Korean economy. But if you look at more medium long term, I think structurally, I think there's a big complementarity between the U.S. and Korea.
Yes.
Because see, obviously, I think the big objective of this Trump, trade policy is obviously reviving, domestic manufacturing and really, boosting this technological capability, especially in this highly sensitive, semiconductor, batteries, bio, etc. But this is an area where Korea can really contribute to, helping U.S. building this new supply chain in the U.S. Because obviously U.S. alone cannot build all these, manufacturing or supply chain. And then if you look out to, find some, kind of viable partners, there are not many, among these like-minded countries.
Right.
And especially it'll be more and more difficult for these Chinese, the businesses to come to the United States and then collaborate in these highly sensitive technologies. So in that sense, I see in shipbuilding, defense industrial sector and bio and, kind of a civil nuclear, this power industry, I see a really bright future between Korea and United States in collaborating and then building these new supply chains in the U.S. So I see, yes, I mean, Biden as well as Trump, they have sort of kind of consistency in terms of building the domestic manufacturing supply chain. But I see it's a more kind of structural kind of complementarity between these two countries.
Right. Navin, getting back to your sequencing comment that if Trump does go ahead and impose tariffs, it would be, I think your take is that it would be advantageous to the U.S. to do this in some geostrategically coherent way. So that would mean China would be number one because, we're competing with China. People in the administration call China's influence, particularly in the South China Sea, as malign influence. It seems to be a word I hear commonly accepted jargon now. And it has the largest trade surplus with the U.S. First 11 months of this year, it's $270 billion. The next is Mexico, $157 billion. So do you see, there's a logic to this, but do you see this as like the way Trump would go? I mean, how would you stick your neck out on that?
I think it depends on whether the tariffs you view largely as a negotiating lever,
Right.
or as policy and we're going to implement it.
Right.
And I think it's not clear which one it is.
Right.
And then even if it is policy, there is an ongoing debate from what we know in the administration between gradualists and, let's just say, more hawkish advisors. Now, imagine if it's leverage. An interesting question is, on the part of the trading partner or the competitor, what do they want?
Right.
And then on our part, what do we really want? So I think it's not always clear. I would say that, let's just take the example of Korea. I fully agree with what Yao said. I would add to that it's not only, for example, what Korea can do in the U.S. to mobilize reindustrialization here. It could be what about Korean markets could be open to U.S. companies. That's an interesting conversation. I was out there, 2023 with the Deputy Secretary on a cybersecurity trade mission. There are interesting opportunities for U.S. companies in Korea to provide services. So there's like a complex set of relationships. And if I were in the shoes like you were, of the Korean government, I would say, well, mirror back to the U.S. administration. What is it that you want? What are you after here? Is it just trade balance, or is it something more? Because the world has changed. And so I would think about, opening up Korea in certain areas where U.S. companies could play. I would also say, yes, great for investment. And I would say, what about research cooperation in emerging technologies, right? A similar conversation, I don't know what the Chinese perspective is. My view is that it's just very hard to ignore civil-military fusion on the part of the Chinese. And it's just an order of magnitude different type of situation than all the other countries we've been talking about. And sort of that's the principal issue. And it really comes down to what can one extract reasonably in that negotiation. And there is a very long menu of things. Like you have to play all the keys on the keyboard to do that if you were in the Trump administration.
And Han-koo, you also, so turning more specifically to Korea, to the IRA, well, the Chips and Science Act, I guess the subsidies are actually being released to Samsung and SK and Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing. But do you see, will this continue? I mean, can Trump actually stop the use of subsidies to promote semiconductor production or EV battery production or EV car production? Is that already baked into policy, or do you expect any change there? Because this would particularly affect South Korean companies.
Yeah, I think South Korean companies are worried about this discontinuing the subsidies policies and kind of industrial policy, because it tends to be that the Republicans favor more of kind of tax cut rather than kind of distributing cash to these companies. But I think that to build this new kind of manufacturing supply chain in the U.S., it needs much more than just money. I recently visited this chips the factory in Texas, and then there were many sort of issues. For example, this workforce, not just STEM, this PhD engineers, but really well-disciplined, well-trained, this manufacturing, the workforce. That's what they were really lacking. And also this fab industry, consumes huge amount of energy. I mean, electricity,
That's right.
as well as water, and then so there's a much more than this just distributing money. But I think up to now, at least this initial stage of this U.S. industrial policy, we can say it was successful in kind of bringing in
Right.
like tens of billions of dollars of investment
Right.
from Korea, from Taiwan in semiconductor batteries, etc. But from now on, what really matters is the implementation
Right.
to make those operations are successful. But if this policy kind of radically changes or kind of stop, then I think those businesses, including Korean businesses, may struggle. So I think this Trump administration, they really need to look at how they can induce these foreign businesses, but how can help those businesses to really localize and then be successful. And that needs a lot of government support. Yeah.
Right. Right. Well, hold on. We'll have a Q&A soon. Just be patient. You'll get your chance.
Would it be okay to jump on that?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
So I was at the Commerce Department during the
Right.
CHIPS implementation with Secretary Armando Debsat-Graves. Couple of things, quick things. The EO on American Trade, for America First Trade, and the EO on energy, none of them mention halting disbursements on chips. That's a promising on chips, right?
Okay.
Which is a bipartisan legislation.
Right.
So that's one. To fully agree with your comments about the impact of the chips investment so far. I mean, leading edge chips are being manufactured in the United States today. That's pretty significant. The issue going forward is probably they're not going to be supporting more firm subsidies to companies, although the existing funding agreements will need to be honored. The interesting thing going forward is if I were to say, what would you do going forward for a CHIPS 2.0? I would say there are a couple of things that I would highlight, and this is something that the Trump administration may want to look at. Number one, tax incentives are also part of the CHIPS program, and they have been strong inducements for investment. Tax incentives for production of development of fabs, tax incentives for design would also be useful to consider going forward.
Right.
So one. Two is fully agree with you on workforce. Now, workforce cannot simply be a government solution. There's a significant funding for workforce under the R&D component of CHIPS, great. But there needs to be a private sector solution, whether it's the Business Roundtable or other such organizations, really getting together with the existing government programs to think about what a workforce development program could be for CHIPS. That's going to be essential, and it needs to work with partners on that. So those two are really important. Third, I would highlight the R&D component and the development and the investment in common infrastructure, common R&D infrastructure for companies. This is a rich agenda, and it's a private sector-oriented agenda. And I fully agree with you on the energy requirements of chips, which will only accelerate as a result of the AI revolution, in addition to the chips building. And I think that the President Trump's EO and his statements around unleashing energy are really quite supportive of that. I would simply say that energy alone is not the binding constraint on American reindustrialization. It's all these other things you talked about. And so I would look to see what they do around that, particularly if it's a Secretary Lutnick, I don't know, whoever comes in there, should understand all the equities, all the capabilities he or she has in the Commerce Department to do this sort of thing. So I just want to reinforce that point.
For the turning to the focusing on the constraints with the workforce constraints, how important is the H-1B visa program, reforming that to allow more qualified foreigners in?
Yeah. Let me put this in context. It has a role, but let me put this in context. One is that if I go back to the goal of we cannot let people and places left behind continue to be left behind. Right. That is a common national consensus. Well, you can't invest in reindustrialization if the people who are native-born Americans are not part of the process of talent development, workforce development, and find a pathway through that to decent jobs. It takes some years to build a technician in a fab. It takes some time to build the next scientist.
Right.
And so, given the accelerating tech competition with China, we can't simply rely on that path.
Right.
We do need a short-term solution in some cases, and it's going to depend on the technology area. And so I think it's worthwhile and there's like a lot of different views that as we've heard over the last few weeks among those in the Trump kind of orbit. There needs to be a balance between what is short-term that's needed to begin to achieve technology advantage and what is the pipeline for workforce development. These actually shouldn't be two separate things. They should be
Right.
part of one agenda, one program to achieve technology advantage.
Right. Right. Okay. Of course, Korea got shortchanged on the H-1B visa allocations under the Chorus Free Trade Agreement. Do you see that changing?
During this Chorus FTA negotiation, one of the main, Korea's interest was to really push for these more quotas in this H-1B visa or even separate visa for Korea. But I think it's kind of, from the U.S. point of view, politically very sensitive. So we didn't really get it
Right.
at that time. But I completely agree with Navin that we need some sort of strike a balance between the
Right.
short-term needs and more kind of a sustainable long-term, path. I mean, yeah, of course, the main point is to really create jobs, in the Midwest and then also this the heartland of the United States. But for the 2-3 years of really kind of ramping up, it's very difficult to find those qualified workforce. Then you need to bring those experts
Right.
from overseas. Otherwise, this is not going to work.
Right. Right. Okay. Turning to strategic minerals, there's an entity called the Strategic Minerals Partnership. Korea is the chair of this this year. Navin, you talked about something's missing from this that we need to focus on. The money. Can you
Listen,
talk more about that?
Let me give you a little context. I worked on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and I must give much credit to Korean partners in the context of IPEF for really galvanizing interest around the critical minerals issue and thinking about pooling our resources and pooling either access to these over time. We have a processing bottleneck or choke point that is significant with the China. And I think when you try to understand what can we do around critical minerals, exhortation is not going to be enough. Using the existing tools, which have grown, like the Development Finance Corporation, to the credit of the last administration, now has a portfolio, I think, of approximately 48, 49 billion. Significant. There have been efforts in the context of IPEF to highlight critical minerals. There's the Critical Minerals Partnership. There's the re-engagement with Africa. But we need a financing solution that is at scale, that ideally combines the resources of Korea, Japan, some European countries, and the U.S., public capital that leverages private capital. There are different ways to do that. I've advocated in the past for something like there was PEPFAR for HIV 20 years ago that's lasted 20 years. Could we think of something like that, blended finance for critical and emerging technologies, including critical minerals, at scale, 8 to 10x leverage with American LPs, Korean LPs, Japanese LPs in the fund that can give us the firepower we need around the world for exploration, for mining and extraction, and importantly for processing outside of China. I would add one more thing. There's a lot of work domestically, particularly in the context of Title III DPA, the Defense Production Act, for some investment in this here in the U.S. That's promising. I would also add that there are new capabilities at the U.S. Export-Import Bank, including for domestic investment, and there's a new supply chain resilience initiative to basically, through offtake agreements with U.S. companies, ensure that they have access to critical minerals. This is demand-side measures. This is excellent. I would say one should scale this up. I hope that the incoming administration is aware of the tools that it is now inheriting, that it didn't have before, and for God's sake, use them and scale them, because we need all of these pieces to work.
Right, right. So this would be a U.S.-led initiative. This is not something like what the multilateral development banks would be doing, the
I'm
World
I'm
Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank or whatever.
I'm a 20-year World Banker in my
Yeah,
previous incarnation. I would say there is a very, very, very unique role that the multilateral institutions play.
right.
I don't think it's replaceable. And it's really hard to rebuild something like that if you throw it away. So that's number one. And that includes country engagement, understanding policy, understanding the dynamics around the mining sector, all of that stuff linked to an economic strategy for countries. Great. But I have to say that if you look at the GAO report on procurement on MDB linked projects, of World Bank linked financed projects, for certain components of that procurement, the lion's share have been won by Chinese companies.
Right,
So
right.
are we shooting ourselves in the foot?
Hmm.
Which is why I feel that this financing solution I talked about should have some ex post or downstream procurement
Right. Hmm.
rules to ensure that our companies, and I would add that to that allied companies, benefit from that.
Right, right.
And otherwise, the Chinese approach is be able to finance and be able to procure, so they have a turnkey solution, or I should say, provide services. We need something analogous to that. And we need to move at pace, at scale, and fast. And I think the Partnership for Global Infrastructure did some of this, but it didn't have that solution. And so we need it.
Good. Um, so Han-koo, this year Korea chairs APEC, 20 years after it did so in Busan. Um, and at that time, we're going back to 2005, right? There was a Busan roadmap to achieve the 1994 Bogar goals of increasing trade and investment, liberalization. There was also energy security on the roadmap as well. How do you see the delta between Busan 2005 and now Korea chairing APEC? What issues are high on the agenda, and what outcomes do you expect?
Myself, actually, in 2005, I got involved in
Uh-huh.
the kind of hosting Busan APEC, and so I think that APEC is very, very important. We call APEC as a sort of incubator of ideas. Obviously, it's not really kind of binding. They don't, negotiate or create legally binding instrument. But I think that could be also a merit because all these countries can kind of brainstorm and come up with new ideas. And there are some of the instances in which APEC came up with idea and then WTO and other organization took it into kind of a more implementable kind of initiative. I think the environmental goods and services negotiation is a good example. That came up from this brainstorming in APEC. So I think now we, in a way, we live in a very turbulent and kind of leaderless, world, which this two big superpower is not really ready to provide this, the leadership for these common goods, especially this global trading environment. And so I think that Korea is, the trading nation. I mean, Korea is a really, epitome of how a poor country can grow to really this advanced country through trade and open trade and multilateral trading system. So in that sense, I think APEC, especially Korea as a chair could, kind of engage and can lead some discussion on how the rest of country can continue to maintain this global trading system and especially in the particular context of this Korean politics. Now, I mean, it's a very, very confusing scene in Korea, but this constitutional court, the verdict may come in the first half of this year, and then we don't know exactly in the second half of this year what is going to be political leadership and landscape in Korea. We don't know yet, but in either case, I think we need the new start. We need to reset, from the second half of this year. And in that sense, I think this APEC will be the first high-profile international forum where Korean leader host all these important leaders from APEC countries and really again begin to lead in some of these critical the agenda.
Right. Before I turn to audience questions, I'd like to ask Navin. So yesterday, or going back to the title of this session today, the Trump administration's economic security policy. Trump gave a speech at Davos. Of course, it was a Zoom speech. What's your key takeaway from that? Did he sharpen the focus on where he's headed for economic security policy?
I think three things that stick out. One is a strong push for energy growth of energy access in order to drive industrialization, particularly AI. So that starts with the binding constraint on industrialization is energy. That's his view.
Right.
You heard that. Two is that he wants to provide a deal, which is at a high level. You'll get tax incentives if you invest. If not, you'll face tariffs. Now, what's strange about that is, what's good about that is that that's a very pro-FDI stance. Like he wants investment.
Right.
And so if I were sitting in Korea, I would say, okay, that's interesting. That's positive. Like at least he's not saying no investment in the U.S.
Right.
I would then say, like, well, if you were to look at that, what is the threshold of investment before you face the risk of tariffs? Like there are some devils in the detail that have to be worked out. And there are other details, but that's the one thing. I don't think the rest of it was surprising. I think these are two big things. Like the U.S. wants to reindustrialize. You either are a part of it or you're not. And I think that, there is a degree of bluster around it, but I would look for the elements of it that show some continuity. So
Right. And Han-koo, you also watched it. What's your key takeaway?
Yeah. I think his message was consistent. I mean, from this the day one inaugural speech and all these the posting through social, and which is America first. And I mean, this Davos is a number one this globalist kind of a gathering, and he wasn't shy. He wasn't shy in really putting out his this strong message of America first. I think what struck me was that he explicitly mentioned that if global businesses come to the U.S., you will have the lowest tax rate. Corporate like 15% tariff. Among the top. I mean the lowest one. But if you produce outside the U.S., you will face tariff.
Right.
So I think it's what is concerning is that I think many global business in Europe and Asia kind of worried that all the business may suck into the U.S. because U.S. may have a kind of lowest energy cost as well as the lowest tax cost. And secondly, but what is encouraging is that he seems to have a very strong conviction on deregulation. I think he kind of shared his personal frustration kind of facing all these red tapes in European Union when he was a kind of business leader. So I think that is good for businesses, and I think this deregulation, and that's this kind of a pragmatic approach could hope that could be kind of adopted in Korea and other countries as well when it comes to this deregulation.
Yeah, I would expect a lot of attention paid to deregulation in the U.S. Well, thank you all. Very rich insights, and putting all this into context was terrific. I'll ask the in-person audience. By the way, our room has filled up. I guess people were spending a lot of time bundling up here in the cold weather in New York. But I'd like to start with a Korea Society members question, Ji-young Lim, and her question is: so what does the panel expect from the Trump administration's immigration policy? We kind of touched on that with the H-1B visas, but Navin, do you have any?
Well, what I can say is our focus is very much on technology competition, and I think I would just reinforce what I said before, which is that it's good to look at the short-term needs as well as the long-term needs as a package. I think that some of our team has been doing some really interesting work on industrialization and the different levels of skill that are required that depend on immigrants.
Right.
And so that's not just the PhD scientists. They're all levels of skill that require immigrants to support industrialization. I think the balance is going to have to always be between building our sort of native workforce versus folks that we bring in. But I don't really have anything beyond that to say at this point.
All right. You have anything to add to answer
Just
to Ji-young?
you know, at the Peterson Institute, we kind of kind of run model of how this immigration tariff and kind of independence of this the Federal Reserve may affect this inflation and the economic growth. And I think what is striking is this immigration deportation. It depends on in which scale it will be implemented, but it could have more inflationary pressure on the U.S. economy than tariff and other factors. So I think because U.S. economy is almost at a kind of full employment status, so I think we have to really carefully watch how this Trump administration adjust kind of their initial plan in terms of how it may have kind of negative impact on the economy.
Right. Okay. Good. Well, Chelsea, do you have a microphone? Let's turn to the audience. So, please identify yourself, and in the interest of getting as many questions as possible, please keep your questions short and to the point. So you're pointing over to my left. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Craig Rosenthal. I just want to ask Navin, you mentioned about expanding more research for chip production. Excuse me, are you talking about expanding the capability of the chip, or could you maybe drill down a little bit more on that?
All kinds of areas of research, new types of chips using new materials, different approaches to building chips or making chips, so you can get efficiency in the processing. So I would just say both on the materials, the chip itself, and the processing or the production and manufacture of chip, all are subject to ongoing research. And the question is, if you want to speed that up and you want to commercialize it, here's a question: can the U.S. do it alone? And the second question is, even if the U.S. can play a much bigger role in it, how do we ensure that those ideas don't die on the laboratory floor, but they find their pathway to commercialization, which may need a financing solution, meaning strategic capital to prevent the valley of death problem where ideas die, but they don't find it to the commercial application. So there's been significant work under the CHIPS Act ongoing with the development of the NatCast, which is basically a kind of a 501c3 that supports this type of work. And I think it's something that hopefully the Trump administration gets its handle on and supports as it goes forward. Secretary Raimondo began that process, so it's in its early stages. And this is unique in the history of U.S. science and innovation policy. It's an important development over the last 80 years, and we should really look into that.
Okay, let's, Steve, wait for the, okay.
Good afternoon, Steve Cartman. My question is, with the prospect of new tariffs and the pressures on the global trading system, do you envision that there will be greater regionalization and potentially regional trading blocks? For example, would Korea focus more of its energies on the ASEAN countries as a result of what's transpiring?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. Number one, yes, I think this regionalism, plurilateralism, will, I think, really kind of prosper. We know that this in Asia, this CPTPP and RCEP have been really going on. And at the Peterson, we are discussing how this plurilateralism, open plurilateralism, could play a role in the absence of this U.S.-China leadership and kind of faltering this multilateralism. And so in that sense, I think if, let's say, European Union kind of join or some sort of form partnership with CPTPP, I think it'll be really big, trading kind of bloc. And also, we need to continue to develop new kind of rules to cope with these emerging new challenges. As Navin mentioned, I also was part of IPEP, and then there's been a lot of discussion on this IPEP, but at least in these new rules, like supply chain resilience or clean energy, those are the new areas that we need to really develop new rules. So in that sense, I think this the plurilateralism and the ASEAN, the importance of ASEAN will grow. Actually, Korea's investment in ASEAN began to surpass from, I think, 2013, Korea's investment in China. And then right now, the ASEAN, in aggregate, Korea's export to ASEAN is, I think, third largest after China, US, and ASEAN. So ASEAN is really important trading as well as this geopolitical partner for Korea.
Let me work in two questions. I'll join them from our virtual audience. One is from related to Steve's question. One is from James Trottier, a Canadian Global Affairs Institute, and another is from Soo-Young Che, a student at Columbia University. So they ask, James says, I am currently in Thailand. Many opinion makers in Southeast Asia are recommending that ASEAN states keep a low profile lest they catch the attention of Donald Trump and have negative trade policies directed at them. What are your views? Do you share those concerns? And let me weave in from Soo-Young Che. Given the heightened focus on economic security and investment screening, what are the implications for cross-border capital flows into Asia? And
maybe I'll take the first one and you second. Yeah. So I think that as I mentioned, earlier, ASEAN obviously face challenges as well as opportunities. For example, Vietnam, I think they are number 3 in terms of the U.S. trade deficit. After I think China and Mexico.
Twice as big as a trade deficit we have.
That's
with
because
Korea.
of many global companies. They kind of move from China to Vietnam and then build their production, and then from there kind of exporting to United States. So I think they might be very cautious what's happening to other countries and kind of try to calibrate their responses. But I think and also in the EO as well, as we talk about this, which was released on day one, there's a kind of this the languages on circumvention and transshipment, etc. But I think also we need to sort of change this rhetoric of this transshipment or circumvention. Actually, it is not really circumvention. I mean, the Korean companies, Japanese companies, they move from China to Vietnam or Southeast Asian countries, and actually that is a sort of process of kind of local industrialization. That's at the first place how Korea began to develop. All these global companies, they first kind of set their production in Japan, and as the cost structure rise, they moved to Korea. And then that's how Korea began to develop their local industry. And this is actually from the more positive side, how these South Asian countries begin to localize and develop their industry. So I think we need to somehow change this kind of negative rhetoric on these global companies, moving or diversifying from China to the Southeast Asian countries.
Okay, good.
I agree with everything y'all said. You said it very nicely. I think to your question, significant scope for arbitrage by countries based on how tariffs are imposed and how they play out. It depends on what their starting point is, depends on their sectors. I think high level, we seem to have forgotten in recent years that global value chains are global in nature and that they are dynamic and they will respond to incentives. And I think that will have to play out. The challenge is, can the U.S. Continue to be integrated into value chains that are going to drive prosperity, productivity enhancement, particularly around advanced technologies, while imposing a tariff policy? And one needs a smarter approach to that. So let's see how it happens. But I think you put your finger on something. With respect to the other side of it, which is investment, there are two dimensions. One is, when it comes to CFIUS and inbound investment, let's see how the policy evolves, or whether there is any kind of renovation of that. It's largely been transaction by transaction, but is there going to be an approach? Based on the Davos comments, it looks like there is a welcoming kind of orientation to foreign direct investment. So let's see. That'll depend on countries of concern and how that plays out. The other thing that was very, very, and I should add to that, significant overtures to the Saudis, to the UAE, and others that have deep pockets. So that's really an interesting development in terms of inbound investment. There is also a requirement in the EO that the Commerce Department, Treasury Department, and others review outbound investment, which was the policy the Biden administration worked through. My sense on that, it's kind of like this arbitrage point. So it might be that we constrain ourselves or our investors who are making illiquid investments, for example, in advanced technologies in China. Fine. But it's worth noting that there is a degree of substitution. There are other sources of capital in those areas in China. And so one has to think about this. Although I fully understand how government policy would be, well, we shouldn't have our investors feeding into that because there's embedded knowledge in these things, and you don't want to actually fuel that. So I actually think that they put that on the table, which means they consider that part and parcel of an economic security strategy. I would just make one plug here, which is that all of these different pieces need to somehow be orchestrated well, and kind of a legacy that's been left by the Biden administration, or at least an unfinished business, is who runs economic security policy for the U.S. government, and can that be done in a coordinated way? Is the Commerce Secretary? Should there be an economic security czar? All these things maybe is a part of the DOGE agenda. I don't know. But.
Yeah, that is a big question. I remember when I was at Moody's, I asked the senior Treasury official. Well, I didn't ask, but one of my colleagues asked. This is going back some time. Who makes fiscal policy in the U.S.? And he laughed at us and he said, the U.S. doesn't have any fiscal policy; it just has fiscal outcomes. So that's still the case. So it would be good to have something orchestrated within the government. Commerce Department has really stepped up, right, in this area, kind of eclipsing USTR in terms of strategic investment and trade policy. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, here's how I would describe it, which is that U.S. economic policy over the last 4 years, and maybe even starting with the end of Trump 1, increasingly the center of gravity was the Commerce Department, because it was focused on competitiveness issues, supply chains, technology policy. And that's across a number of advanced technologies that I've mentioned. And so there is a set of equities in the Commerce Department across its 13 bureaus that is really quite unique. And that has now become the sort of spearhead or tip of the spear for U.S. economic policy. The fact that there isn't a revival of TPP, even under the Biden administration, but an Indo-Pacific economic framework, 3 of the 4 pillars run by the Commerce Department, it underscores what you're saying. Is that going to be the case going forward? I don't know. Is this going to be really a function of who the principals are, or is kind of the The landscape that was left under Biden, is it going to continue? I don't know, but certainly significant equities in the Commerce Department.
Right. Okay. Well, at least we have some sort of institutional locus for these important policies. So let's go to the audience again. Do we have another question over here to my left, behind our girder? Oh, we'll get a mic.
Hi, my name is Steve Schuster. Do you see any movement of Korean companies to publicly list here and access capital, as there's been some decline in Chinese companies listing here, but you've seen some increase in other countries in East Asia?
Mm-hmm. I have no expertise in this area. What I can say is, as Tom mentioned, in 2023, the Korean companies topped the rank in terms of investing in the United States. And obviously, there's a greenfield investment. But I think recently, I think that one of the recent kind of high-profile case of enlisting in the U.S. stock market was, I think, Coupang.
Coupang.
Right? Yeah,
right.
Coupang. Yeah. I think it's possible that this with this kind of investment boom in the U.S., Korean companies may show more interest in coming to the U.S. and listing here. And
Good. Okay. Well, we're just about at our allotted hour, so I'd like to thank our panelists, Han-koo and Navin, for sharing your insights. Very informative. And I thank our audience for showing up both in person and online. And I'd like to encourage our audience to join the Korea Society as a member if you haven't done so already, so that we can continue to have, I think, highly valuable programs such as this. If you become a member, you could also join our membership party. We're having our membership party on January 29th. Is that right, Chelsea? It's a lot of fun. We have it right here. So thank you all for coming to the Korea Society today. Thank you.